Good morning.
Good morning.
Here we are on the porch of the original Wormley family cottage. And we're here today with Don Graves, who is a direct descendant of the Wormley family. And today we're going to learn about the Wormley history, and especially at Highland Beach. A few years ago, Don wrote The Wormleys at Highland Beach, 120 Years. And we're taking our interview from his story that's outlined in this booklet. So Don, I'm going to turn it to you, and you can tell us your story.
Well, thank you very much, and greetings to everybody. Thank you for this opportunity, because it's really important to share this information for posterity. One of the things that I'm really concerned about is that with all the valiant efforts of the Douglas Museum volunteers to preserve the history, we aren't getting the national acknowledgement of the significance of Highland Beach community. The reality is Highland Beach didn't just get started in 1893. It really had its origins in the civil rights movement in the pre-Civil War era. The Frederick Douglass and James Wormley, the Wormley Hotel proprietor in Washington in the middle and last half of the 19th century, were very good friends. The families were very close. They had become acquainted in the civil rights efforts of the 1840s and 50s. They all worked with Garrison. They worked with the most of the benevolent societies for African American history and civil rights advocacy, and they became very much colleagues and allies. In fact, Charles R. Douglas, the founder of Highland Beach, as a young man joined the Union Army along with his brother and James Wormley's two sons, William H.A. Wormley and James T. Wormley. And they all served in the Civil War. In fact, Charles R. Douglas wrote back to his father when they were at Petersburg, describing how they were all there for that big engagement. After the war, the families continued to be friends and corresponded regularly. And both James T., even though he had gone to Howard to become Howard's first medical school graduate, first graduate of any division in Howard University, ultimately ended up being a real estate developer and operated the hotel after his father passed away. And Charles R. Douglas began to dabble in real estate also. So we all know the story about how Charles came down here to the Bay Ridge and wasn't admitted to the Bay Ridge Hotel. He and came here to what was the farm of the Brashears and bought it. But he had to, as a speculator, he had to develop it. And the first thing that he did was he platted Highland Beach. And this is probably the only existing original plat of Highland Beach community as it was originally formed. And this is what he would use to market the lots. If you remember, this was pretty vacant land. It was farmland and open with some woodlands interspersed. But he carved out and mapped out these streets. A couple of curious things. There was a boardwalk along the beach going over. This is the Bay Ridge location where the famous hotel was. This is the boardwalk. And there was what they called the Arundel and Bay Ridge Short Line Railroad that ran along the beach, along the water. And it was to serve Bay Ridge, Arundel, and then they could go all the way into Annapolis. So they had a transportation hub already. That was put in about 1893 or 1894. It didn't last very long. I think the train stopped operating in about 1920. And they removed the train tracks about 1930. My oldest son, Don Jr., was wading in the water one day here at the end of Bay Avenue. It had already been eroded a lot, and he stubbed his toe. And here's an original railroad spike from the Bay Ridge Short Line Railroad that was left down there. It got buried in the sand, and it just happened as it eroded. The sand eroded. He was able to find this spike. I thought it's a pretty significant piece. So this, again, this was very informal. These were all friends. And I'm going to go back to the history of Highland Beach. Most of the original property owners here, there might have been half a dozen or 10, were among the fortunate, prosperous Washingtonians who were following the standard of the day. If you remember, at the turn of the 19th century, even white America was trying to escape the heat and close proximity of urban life. So everybody wanted to go somewhere where you could go. Well, when Charles Douglas came down here and couldn't go to Bay Ridge property, he said, well, I'm going to make my own. And he developed it. So this house was built in phases. It was first just one story, and there's a picture of just the single story without this porch, without all these additions, without the second floor. That was after they had been coming down here for a decade using tents. It was really essentially a lot of woodlands. There weren't any streets as such. And my mother used to tell me that it was really essentially trails between the houses through the woods, and people would walk. And then they began to carve these more formalized streets in, but they were really dirt. And then they became shells. They would use shells as the paving mechanism. And then even when some of us were younger, they even started to put a little bit of asphalt. And look at Ben and Dina, and you remember it was kind of gravel with some pieces of shells and a little bit of tar down two strips. And that was their form of paving. Anyway, it's so after they got finished with the camping, and I guess they got their pennies together and were able to build a structure, they built this first floor structure, and then about in the early 20s, they added a second floor, which included extending out this porch, because the second floor actually extends out over the edge of this porch. And then they built these other outer buildings, because in those days everything was wood and coal, and they were concerned about fire, so they would try to build the kitchen areas separate from the main house. They didn't want to have the kitchens actually in the house. In fact, there are 3 chimneys in this house. Each of them have an opening in the chimney where they could put the exhaust, because they would have wood burning stoves. And we have 3 wood burning cast iron stoves still here in storage, where they would have used them to heat them in the cooler time periods. There was a chicken house here back in the corner of the property where they raised chickens for the eggs. My grandfather had peach trees and pear trees, and he grew other vegetables, and I have home videos of him with a sprayer where he would spray to kill the insects. We had apple trees down in front here. So you really, even though you had a house structure, you still were living a pretty rustic life. So in those first 50 years, you would use things like a lantern like this, kerosene lantern. There were also some glass kerosene lamps that you would have to use, and you were pretty isolated. There might have been 10 families. There were always guests.
But I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the Wormleys now, the family and the beginnings.
Thank you. Because I'm old, I guess I've done a lot of research, and I've gone all the way back to when they first arrived in Washington in 1814. Mary Wormley, or Polly, had just recently been manumitted by her master from Albemarle County, and while she was husband and wife with Lynch Wormley, he lived at the cotton plantation, which was about 1.5 miles from the plantation she was on. We believe Lynch was already free, but she was freed in 1813. when they came to Washington in 1814, they already had the hookup with all the leaders in Washington. So all the presidents, all the members of the cabinet, secretaries of state, the members of the American Colonization Society, all looked out for them. And he became a hack driver, and those were his patrons. And his first business was set up at 14th and E, which is the current site of the Commerce Department, which just so happens to be the location where my son now is the deputy secretary, who actually is statutorily required to run the entire Commerce Department of 40,000 people. And his office is right at the first place where a black first had an opportunity to be in business in Washington, D.C. He started out, James Wormley started out with his hotel business in 1850 and became very successful in the 1850s. When the Civil War came, he still was operating a series of 5 houses connected to each other or adjoining each other on High Street. But the thing that's important to me, I am determined, my family has always been determined to try to preserve this. As I started out, this was really supposed to be a retreat from urban life. We're doing our best to try to preserve this as much of a natural preserve as possible. It's probably the largest contiguous parcel. My cousins have lots along Bruce Avenue. One is in London and one is in Philadelphia, and the one is looking to build down here probably sometime soon, which is great. Part of the reason this was successful early on because it was the only place that we could go, and you've heard the story many, many times. We were not allowed to go anywhere. We had to stay to our own, so we built our own and became great. But then a curious thing happened in the 60s when things began to open up for the blacks in the community, and we found we could go anywhere. The younger folks started opting to go to the very public, open resorts, and our community began to suffer because we weren't getting the infusion of the young folks around. And the curious thing is, all of a sudden, now there's a desire to be back, and there's so much investment here. Yeah, I'm even putting some paint on some of the places here because it's important to save. I'm intending, my little grandchildren are running around here. I'm trying to infuse in them. This is something that you never ever leave. It means too much to you. It means too much to us as a people of color. The original family members who owned this, Mary and Imogene, in the 1890s, very Victorian in their approach. And I remember 2 favorite stories. We would have somebody who would cook, and there was a little tiny silver bell that would sit on the mantelpiece, and you weren't allowed to yell. There was no yelling allowed. And what they would do is, when dinner was ready, you hear this little bell ring, tinkle, 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 and that was your call to dinner. If you didn't hear that bell, you didn't eat. So you were just hard out of luck, because once they cleaned up, it was time to clean up. Like I said, this is a morphing community, but it's a good thing. And I'm so glad to see that people like the committee that's working on this is working hard to preserve this heritage. It's really meaningful, and you won't know where you're going until you know where you've come from.
Where you've been, exactly.
So,
well, thank you for sharing your story, Don, because this is something I've learned some new things myself.
I've got a lot more.
I
just stopped.
Look, we'll call this part 1. And when we come back to part 2, we'll hear some more. But I want to thank you for taking part in our Porch Story series. And we look forward to sharing your story with the world.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for doing this.